Hey everybody, this is a piece by an Alenka Zupančič. It's from a book titled On the Critique of Identity, edited by Ivo Ritzer. The piece is titled Identity, Politics, Desire. The term, quote, identity politics rose to prominence in the recent years. But we are often reminded that, for example, every single step in the push to end systemic racism, from the abolition of slavery to the civil rights movement to Black Lives Matter, was and is part of what's known as identity politics today. My first question is this true, or is there nevertheless an important shift that takes place when we move from emancipatory struggles of different social groups to what is called, quote, identity politics? The question is rhetorical. I do believe there is a significant shift that takes place here, and what gets lost in, quote, identity politics is precisely politics. More strongly put, quote, identity politics can function as a means of controlling, indeed policing, framing, managing, neutralizing the properly political blast at the heart of different emancipatory movements and struggles. Let me first explain what I call here identity politics. I use the term to refer to social management that first divides people into many different categories or asks them to define their own categories, and then proclaims that they should all be equally included in the social space. But where does it stand when it, often in a rather paternalizing way, proclaims this? In some neutral place above all these differences and their antagonisms. I would say that this pretentious and false universalism is precisely what feeds the populist backlash, which claims that all this is a complot of, quote, liberal elites. That is, of people who take themselves to be above all these positions and struggles and pursue their own agenda from there. There's a grain of truth in these populist claims, insofar as these populist claims refuse the image of the social space at work here, namely the image of the social space as a neutral container for many different positions which we, parenthesis, or the, quote, power, end parenthesis, should recognize and give equal rights to or not. There is something profoundly apolitical in this perspective on the social as ideally a universal, quote, safe space. It is apolitical because it represses, parenthesis, and purposefully neutralizes, in parenthesis, the social and other antagonisms that define the contours of that space, parenthesis, of the, quote, container, end parenthesis, itself. True political universality does not come from perceiving the social field as a neutral container of different interests struggling for recognition. True political universality comes from addressing the antagonism and the exclusions that are constitutive of that social space as such. Simply put, when we truly, that is beyond the lip service and the jargon of political correctness, include what has been excluded and repressed, we no longer find ourselves in the same social space. It's not the same space, only broader, more, quote, inclusive. It gets shattered in its foundations and cannot but change in its essence. And this is because all kinds of different social coordinates tend to meet at that point of exclusion and are affected by, pulled in the struggle and change, even if they are not directly targeted. Quote, identity politics usually takes place as a political strategy that aims at preventing this systemic consequence. Precisely. It does so by disavowing not the content of the oppressed. On the contrary, this is something that it likes to flag constantly, but by disavowing the mechanism of repression. The repressed content is recognized and acknowledged, yet the repressive process itself is not removed by this, but remains untouched. Footnote. In his own work on repression, Freud first articulated this possibility as something at work in the phenomena of negation. End footnote. As a matter of fact, this disavowing is precisely what the psychoanalytic concept of, parenthesis, fetishist, and parenthesis, disavow, parenthesis, Verleugnung, and parenthesis, is about, and what distinguishes it from simple denial as refusal to see or acknowledge something. In the case of disavowal, we don't deny the traumatic content, but readily admit to it, acknowledge it, and proclaim our awareness of it. Yet this admission is without consequences, cut off, as it were, from the shattering implications of this knowledge. It is enough that we know and publicly proclaim that we know, and this seems to buy us the possibility to go on with our lives without this proclaimed knowledge changing anything in the foundations of the structure in which we operate. Footnote: Octave Manoni's seminal text on disavowal also explores this same constellation. End footnote. By thus relating identity politics to disavowal, I don't want to say that identity politics does nothing good for the groups it targets and affirms. It certainly does or can do. What I'm saying is that it does so by simultaneously obfuscating not simply the roots of this or that exclusion/domination, but also its relations to the objective coordinates of a given social space. The result is often that the inclusion or recognition of the repressed fails to really affect and change their social status. Repression can continue even though repression's victims are fully, quote, recognized. The status and acknowledgement of blacks has certainly changed a lot in the past decades, and also thanks to identity politics. But the question remains as to whereas the mechanism of blacks' repression, parenthesis, ontological exclusion is different from the empirical exclusion, end parenthesis, have really changed that much. One would be inclined to say, no, not really. We'll be returning to this point later in the text. Let's first take the example of the difference between feminism as political movement and as part of identity politics. The U.S. had the historic lead in the feminist struggle, which is probably due to the connection of the latter to the abolition movement. Many of the first activists of women's suffrage became politically aware during that movement and saw their struggle as a continuation of the same emancipatory struggle. Footnote: just a few reminders which can be rather shocking if one was born in the late part of the last century, in what is called a liberal democratic society, and if one hence takes certain rights for granted as being there since forever. Women only got the right to vote in 1920 in the U.S., in 1944 in France, in 1971 in Switzerland at the federal level, and only 1984 in Liechtenstein. End footnote. As it developed in more detail elsewhere, feminism did not emerge from trying to affirm some other female identity and its rights, but from the fact that roughly half the human race referred to as, quote, woman was non-existent in a political sense. It is this non-existence which actually functioned as a homogeneity of the social space. The feminist struggle transformed into a split, a division which concerns all. In this context, it is essential that at stake in this gesture is not a political affirmation of some independently existing ontological divide, parenthesis, between, quote, men and, quote, women, end parenthesis, but something that first constitutes sexual difference as difference or divide, makes it visible, and it does so by forcing us to think it as a division, a split of the same world. It starts by what we may call cracking, breaking the, quote, container. That is what makes this movement, quote, political, and this is where its universality lies. The inclusion of excluded into this world politicizes this world, brings out this world's founding and repressed antagonisms and possible connections. The reference to a particular identity, parenthesis, quote, woman, end quote, end parenthesis, does not exclude universality, but deploys this particular identity as the ground for a universal struggle. Feminists do not identify simply with, quote, femininity, but also with this struggle. The traditional division between masculine and feminine worlds, domain spheres, for example, public, private, actually does not see sexual difference as difference, but as a question of belonging to two separate worlds, which are, quote, different from a neutral bird's-eye description, but otherwise coexist as integral parts in the hierarchy of a higher cosmic order, the wholeness and unity of which is in no way threatened by this, quote, difference. These are parts that, quote, know their place, end quote. And feminism, as a political movement, puts in question and breaks precisely this unity of the world, based on massive suppression, subordination, and exclusion. Once again, the exclusion is not an exclusion of female identity. On the contrary, the mythology of female identity is precisely what has made this exclusion possible and what sustains it. The theme of, quote, feminine identity, end quote, sustains the difference and exclusion on the pre-political level, on the level of belonging to two different worlds. In this sense, emancipatory politics begins with a, quote, loss of identity, and there is nothing deplorable in this loss. Preachers of traditional values usually propagate the political exclusion of women precisely by evoking their specific identity. The political explosiveness of the, quote, woman question, end quote, does not lie in any specificity or positive characteristics of women, but in its capacity to inscribe the problem of division and difference into the homogeneity of the world, which is based on exclusion. This exclusion, and this point is absolutely crucial, is not simply the exclusion of the other side, or half, but above all the exclusion, quote, repression, of the split, social antagonism, as such. It does not only repress or exclude women, it also represses the social antagonism that demands, necessitates this exclusion, and this level is precisely what identity politics tends to disavow. Its reappearance in the form of feminist struggle is the appearance of the social division in the pure state, and this is what makes it political and politically explosive. What exactly does, quote, politically explosive mean? Politically explosive means two related things. One, shattering for the existing objective/general order of things, and two, susceptible of instigating, triggering, relating, uniting different kinds of struggles, is a contagious thing. It works by way of identification with the negativity, caesura, that drives and constitutes the cause of the struggle, rather than by identification with the victims. Solidarity is not the same thing as identification, or as belonging to the same identity group, and it is also not simply a matter of proclamations and statements, proclaimed in outraged awareness of the injustice that is taking place, but a matter of risk, as I will argue, a matter of desire in the strong sense of the term. Let me propose a recent example of a politically explosive movement, which also brings to the fore the nexus of risk and desire in emancipatory struggle. The example is the feminist yet general uprising in Iran, which is also a good example of how quick we, in the West, are to disavow its true political and emancipatory potential by reading it through the lenses of, quote, human rights and freedoms, end quote. This reading makes the uprising come across in roughly these terms, quote, they want to become like us and have the same kind of freedoms as we do, end quote. This in turn instigates an immediate reflex reaction on the left, which is critical of neoliberal order to begin with, and sees no truly liberating perspective in more countries joining in and becoming like us, ... Instead of this precipitated recognition with which we pass a verdict on the desire of the Iranian protesters, knowing very well what they want, let us remember first that one of the key slogans that appeared in the uprising was, quote, neither a leader nor a prince, end quote, neither religious autocracy nor secular Western liberal democracy. This is not surprising if we bear in mind that while in the past decades the fascist Iranian government entered into an ideological cultural conflict with the U.S. and the, quote, West, Iran simultaneously adopted the Western neoliberal capitalist model without much restraint, opting for massive privatization and economic deregulation, entirely in accordance with the International Monetary Fund. The death of Mahsa Amini was the event that set fire to the Iranian social fabric. Which was already bursting with contradictions, antagonisms, and injustices. Not only regarding women, but also regarding the socioeconomic situation of the vast majority of people. Now I'm going to read the introduction to the Wikipedia article for the death of Mahsa. What did I say? Did I say Mahsa before? Mahsa Amini. On the 16th of September 2022, 22-year-old Kurdish-Iranian woman Mahsa Amini, also known as Gina Amini, died in a hospital in Tehran, Iran, under suspicious circumstances. The Guidance Patrol, the religious morality police of Iran's government, had arrested Amini for allegedly not wearing the hijab in accordance with government standards. The Law Enforcement Command of the Islamic Republic of Iran stated that she had a heart attack at a police station, collapsed and fell into a coma before being transferred to a hospital. However, eyewitnesses, including women who were detained with Amini, reported that she was severely beaten and that she died as a result of police brutality, which was denied by the Iranian authorities. The assertions of police brutality, in addition to leaked medical scans, led some observers to believe Amini had a cerebral hemorrhage or stroke due to head injuries received after her arrest. Amini's death resulted in a series of protests described by CNN as more widespread than the protests in 2009, 2017, and 2019, and by the New York Times as the largest Iranian protest since at least 2009. Iran Human Rights reported that by December 22, at least 476 people had been killed by security forces attacking protests across the country. Amnesty International reported that Iranian security forces had fired into groups with live ammunition and killed protesters by beating them with batons. Amini's death ignited the global woman life freedom movement rooted in her Kurdish background, which demands the end of compulsory hijab laws and other forms of discrimination and oppression against women in Iran. During the ensuing events, some female demonstrators removed their hijab or publicly cut their hair as acts of protest. Back to the text. The combination of theocracy and rentier capitalism resulted in a particularly devastating social order. So what happened? The government decided to exacerbate the cultural and religious stakes which remained the only significant difference from the despised Western other, whereas economically it was rather the sameness or similarity that prevailed. The exclusion of women from the social and political space of the Islamic Republic was indeed primarily religious, but this cultural difference started increasingly to function as a decoy designed to distract from economic sameness with the West. It increasingly functioned as a mask of the lack, the absence of economically sustained political difference. Thus, we could say that the hijab became the elected veil of this lack of difference. The oppression here became worse for this very reason. Women were forced to embody and display the difference that no longer had any real material basis. This is why the hijab became much more than a sign of, quote, cultural and religious difference. The hijab became a symbol of all these different antagonisms and struggles that it was requested to mask. The feminist color of the revolution does not narrow its scope. On the contrary, the uprising cuts across many different divides. Let's stay with this example some more. During the protest, not only were some very significant formulations of the, quote, neither religious autocracy nor secular Western liberal democracy formulated, but also some extremely incisive analyses of desire, its role, and its operation in the protests. A great example of this is an anonymous text written by one of the protesters, translated into English and published under the title, Figuring a Woman's Revolution, Bodies Interacting with Their Images. The text was written early in the protests and published online on the 5th of October 2022, but it has lost none of its significance and insights. I will highlight just a couple of its elements. The author points to the shift that occurred very early on, and in comparison to other earlier protests, the shift from videos to photographs, from movements to fixed immobile figures, which can nevertheless trigger a movement or rather a chain, a metonymy of events, as well as the shift from expressing one's desire to becoming a figure of desire. The key moment in this shift is the famous photograph of Mida Movahed, simply standing still in a utility box, holding a stick with her headscarf tied to it, for which she was immediately arrested. Wikipedia says Vida Movahed, more commonly known as Vida Movahed, is an Iranian human rights activist, protester, and women's rights activist who is considered the initiator of the Girls of Hijab movement. On December 27th, 2017, at the on the Hijab Street in Tehran, she symbolically took her white headscarf off to protest against the mandatory hijab in Iran. Subsequently, Vida Movahed's picture was published as the Girl of Hijab Street. And Wikipedia says for the Iranian protest against compulsory hijab, the Girls of Hijab protests were protests against the compulsory hijab in Iran, part of the wider Iranian democracy movement. The protests were inspired by Vida Movahed, an Iranian woman known as the Girl of Hijab Street, who stood in the crowd on a utility box on Hijab Street, Revolution Street in Tehran on the 27th of December 2017 during the 2017 to 2018 Iranian protests, who tied a white headscarf to a stick and waved it to the crowd as a flag. She was arrested on that day and was released temporarily on bail a month later on the 20th of January 2018. Some people interpreted Movahed's action as being based on Masih Alinejad's call for White Wednesdays, a protest movement that the presenter at VOA Persian television started in early 2017. Other women later reenacted her protest and posted photos of their actions on social media. These women were described as the, quote, Girls of Hijab Street and the, quote, Girls of Revolution Street in English sources. Some of the protesters, however, claimed that they were not following Masih Alinejad's call. The protests intensified in 2022 due to the death of Mahsa Amini. Back to the text. According to the author, this was, quote, a departure point, away from the message-centered, face-centered videos of, quote, White Wednesdays, mostly selfies of women walking on the street and saying something to explicate the situation and their desires. Vida Movahed became the dense figure of all the videos before her that women had uploaded of walking without hijab. In contrast to these women, she was silent fixed, the point of transition from video to photograph, ... a shift from an individual speaking about herself and her desire to a silent fixed figure, end quote. This gave rise to a flood of images similar in nature, again photographs rather than videos, photographs that stimulated this uprising and drove it forward in all kinds of different and unlikely places, new images like this emerging every day. Footnote, for example, the photo of Zina, or Mahsa Amini, on the hospital bed. The photo of Zina's relatives holding each other in grief in the hospital. The image of Kurdish women in the Aichi cemetery, waving their headscarves in the air. The photograph of Zina's gravestone. The figure of the torch-bearing woman of Kashevars Boulevard. The figure of the woman standing solo in the street, facing the water cannon in Valley Asur Circle. The figure of the sitting woman. The figure of the standing woman. The figure of the woman carrying a sign in Tabriz, eye to eye with the forces of repression. The figure of the woman who ties her hair. The picture of the dance circle around a bonfire in Bandar Abbas, and many others. End footnote. What is so very interesting here is the shift from representing the conflict and the protests, to becoming, embodying the cause of their continuation, in spite of the austerity with which the regime responded. The images that became iconic did not necessarily capture the intensity of conflict, the cruelty of repression, or the unfolding of events. In these images, a body, quote, is not narrated in a linear temporal continuum on a video meant to represent repression, or confrontation, or action, but instead crystallized in a revolutionary instant, ... A a figure pause. There is no need for the before and after of this moment in a video recording, because the figure is created not in a temporal continuum, but in a historic arrest, in a pause. It's where the heart of history stops beating for a second." End quote. One cannot think of Walter Benjamin and his notion of the dialectics at a standstill. Footnote, quote, "It's not that what is past casts its light on what is present, or what is present its light on the past. Rather, image is that wherein what has been comes together in a flash with the now to form a constellation. In other words, image is dialectics at a standstill. For while the relation of the present to the past is purely temporal, a purely temporal continuous one, the relation of what has been to the now is dialectical. It is not progression but image, suddenly emergent. Only dialectical images are genuine images, that is, not archaic, and the place where one encounters them is language." End quote. Benjamin. End footnote. But this is not all. Something also shifted within the photographic form itself, something described by the author as a move from the desire of the photographer to the figure of desire as such. Quote, "Close-ups of beautiful faces in the garb of resistance," parenthesis, "the desire of the photographer," end parenthesis, "have given way to images of figures of resistance," parenthesis, "the desire of the subject," end parenthesis, end quote. Surprisingly and crucially, an essential part of this is none other than facelessness. Quote, "We had seen images of resisting women before, pictures of the Women's Protection Units in Syrian Kurdistan, YPJ. For example, the difference between those photos and the figures of women in the recent protests is the centrality of the face in the former and the facelessness of the latter." End quote. And Wikipedia says, "The Women's Protection Units, YPJ, or Women's Defense Units, is an all-female militia involved in the Syrian civil war. The YPJ is part of the Syrian Democratic Forces and armed forces of the Democratic Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, and closely affiliated with the male-led YPG, while the YPG is mainly made up of Kurds. It also includes women from other ethnic groups in northern Syria." Back to the text. This may strike us as paradoxical, and is particularly intriguing in the context of tearing down the hijab. It gives a whole new dimension to this gesture and this demand. Removing the hijab is not about revealing your face or freeing your face, but rather about freeing the desire or the revolutionary figure from the bondage of the face, Quote, "Faces and names abort the figure's power to arouse the desires of other women because they render the situation of that figure different and special compared to the general situation of women. Now the figure has freed itself from the bondage of the face. It is a general faceless figure, covered with a mask, a face for reasons of security, an image shot from behind, nameless, anonymous. The political body of women now circulates on the streets." End quote. The true revolutionary, emancipatory impact of these images is not desirable as, quote, "hijab off," end quote, but rather as face off. This is the becoming, the maintaining of the revolutionary subject. Yet more is at stake here than the difference between a name, as constituting a distinction, and anonymity, as opening the space for everyone. A name and a face can of course incite revolutionary movement by means of identification, but what we have here is precisely something other than a form of identification. Quote, "I think that in place of the initial statement, quote, 'I could also have been Zina,' end quote, bracket, in other words, I could have also died in the custody of the morality police, end bracket. The image of the torch-bearing woman on the car aroused an intense desire that, quote, 'I also want to be that figure,' end quote. The desire to express that figure of promise," end quote. This point is absolutely crucial. It is here that the revolt, the unrest, gets attached to an absolute condition, which, so to say, magnetizes the desire, drives a stimulating chain of desires, the incitement of other women's desire to strike their own figures, to give body to and hence make visible the ontological negativity that sustains the given order. Footnote. Quote, people, and especially women, are going after this new desire hard, and this same desire increasingly drives forward a chain of stimulating further desires to create figures and situations of resistance. I want to be that woman with the figure of resistance, the one I saw in the photo, and I create a figure, end quote. End footnote. And that is precisely what, quote, moving to the streets, end quote, means. Risking one's life to keep the desire alive, to, as the author keeps emphasizing, inspire, arouse, provoke the desire of the other, of others. It is the desire to be the cause of this particular (political) and desire. The central shift at issue here, then, is the shift from identification with the victims and images of other women to suffering that can no longer be called identification, or only if we allow for what I previously called, quote, identification with negativity, end quote, with the repressed negative core of the positive order of things. Quote, I also want to be that figure, end quote, does not mean that I want to be like this or that person, with all or some of their characteristics, or to see myself in this way. It means something quite different. Namely, I, also, want to give body to this same lack. I want to figure as embodiment of the crack, of the repressed negativity inherent in the existing order, for everyone to see, is the desire to display this lack, this exclusion, by giving body to this exclusion. And giving body to this lack is something rather different from claiming the rights of one's body, standing up for your body's freedom. It implies almost the opposite, namely allowing, even willing, for one's body to be mobilized for this cause of demonstrating the lack of the other. This aspect is easily lost in our, quote, Western sensibility, end quote, but let's remember that it constitutes an essential part of hysteria, allowing one's body to be mobilized in expression as a figure of some wrong or as a figure of protest. Nowadays, instead of hysteria, we like to speak of, quote, conversion disorder, end quote. The latter is defined as bodily symptoms, such as numbness, blindness, paralysis, mutism, that appears in the absence of organic causes. This is a typical psychological misnomer, to say the least. If anything, instead of, quote, conversion disorder, it would be more appropriate to call it, quote, conversion of disorder, a turning of disorder into a bodily symptom. A turning of disorder into a bodily symptom is not a disease, it is a bodily conversion that signals a disorder, something that objectively exists or affects the subject. Freud saw this very well. The disorder is in the real. It is out there, and it is wrong to reduce it simply to a subjective pathology. Moreover, there is a big difference between the inability to cope with a traumatic reality, and the desire to signal it to others, to make them see the traumatic character of some reality. When psychoanalysis speaks of, quote, hysterical theater, end quote, it is not to slur the hysterical desire, to imply that it is all just a show. On the contrary, it is to recognize and acknowledge the will, indeed the desire, to display that something is terribly wrong or missing, to stage and perform this fact. Let me point out yet another way in which desire plays an important role in emancipatory thinking, which necessitates a few words about the psychoanalytic, and particularly the Lacanian concept of desire. There exists a well-elaborated Lacanian genealogy of desire that starts from the need, its articulation in speech, as a demand for this or that, and the margin constituted because the object that satisfies the need misses the point of the demand, which is not only a demand for this or that object, but also a demand for love. This margin, gap, void, is the field of desire proper, but instead of retracing this genealogy, we can approach this question from the other end. Footnote, quote, desire is neither the appetite for satisfaction nor the demand for love, but the difference that results from the subtraction of the first from the second, the very phenomenon of their splitting, end quote. Lacan, end footnote. But instead of retracing this genealogy, we can approach this question from the other end. Lacan's key move is also to de-psychologize the notion of desire. Lacan starts out from what we may call a fundamental imbalance of being. That is, with being constituting itself around something falling out. Around something falling out. Being qua being is the other side of something falling out of being. And Lacan posits that the subject, qua subject of desire, emerges from this imbalance, or the lack of being, by way of subjectivizing it in this or that way. In other terms, subject is the way in which the imbalance, the negative core of structure appears, takes place as an event within this structure itself. This is the event of desire. It is something which, within the structure that gives rise to desire, brings to the fore the gap that gave rise to it. Desire is in this way somewhat like a play within the play. Hence perhaps its often, quote, theatrical aspect, associated especially with hysteria. It plays out, quote, performs, reenacts the very excluded, fallen out condition of its own existence. It reintroduces, it brings this absolute condition into play, into reality. And like a play within the play, just think of the mousetrap in Hamlet. It is a figuration of truth. A figuration of truth. Not its revelation or disclosure, but its figuration. This, quote, fictitious figuration is the way, the only way, of inscribing into reality the real of an exclusion on which this reality is founded. Exclusion that further on constitutes the ground of repression. If desire operates by persistently proclaiming that, quote, that's not it, is not because it is so, quote, picky and is not satisfied with anything, but because the structure with which and from which it emerges is itself based on nothing, a nothing that exists as a gap, as a, quote, negative magnitude, which is the true cause of desire. In its most elemental structure, desire signals the imbalance that sustains the order of being, and aims, beyond all objects, to shake this order, to bring about a shift in the order of being. This radical aim and dimension of desire can get lost in the everyday economy of desire, for desire is also known for often actively sustaining the order about which it complains. But this possible economy should not prevent us from recognizing the inherently upsetting as well as orientating dimension of desire that plays a key role in genuine emancipatory political struggle. It is essential to keep this in mind. Desire does not exist because some people are simply never satisfied or prefer to remain unsatisfied. Subjective desire exists first of all because the objective order of things contains a gap, a lack. The lack as the cause of desire is, quote, out there. This dimension is completely lost when we flatten desire, starting with hysterical desire, into a, quote, psychological type, end quote. Quote, she does not know what she wants, she is satisfied with nothing, ... end quote. When in Seminar 20, Lacan formulates the movement of desire like this, quote, I ask you, what? To refuse, what? What I offer you, why? Because that's not it, end quote. Lacan is spelling out, writing out the ontological anchoring of desire, or lack thereof, and not describing desire's, quote, whims, or describing a, quote, hysterical psychology. Lacan is spelling out the way in which desire tells the truth. What is truth? Not that as a matter of fact. That is not, quote, it, because something else is, quote, it. And not even the truth about how, quote, there is no ultimate object of satisfaction, end quote, or about how this object structurally, quote, always already, end quote, lacks. No, this may be a, quote, correct way of describing the given configuration, but it is not its truth. Its truth is that subjects suffer because of the concrete ways in which this ontological imbalance or deficit exists in the world. Let me conclude with another example. When blacks are given this or that, quote, right, and insist that, quote, that's not it, end quote, it's not simply because more rights could and should be given or because they are never satisfied and don't understand that this is all about an endless progress towards full equality, ... If you read authors of so-called, quote, Afropessimism, which occasionally have a very different, much more interesting and radical take on this issue than identity politics or, quote, affirmative action, they reply to this, you completely miss the point. It is not that we want more rights or different rights. We want to be, and that is impossible in this world. Our being is excluded from the world such as it is, regardless of its progress in terms of rights and political correctness. Wikipedia says Afropessimism is a critical framework that describes the ongoing effects of racism, colonialism, and historical processes of enslavement in the United States, including the transatlantic slave trade and their impact on structural conditions, as well as the personal, subjective, and lived experience and embodied reality of African Americans, is particularly applicable to U.S. contexts. According to the 2018 Oxford Bibliography entry on Afropessimism, written by Patrice Douglas, Salamowit T. Terefe, and Frank B. Wilderson III, Afropessimism can be understood as, quote, a lens of interpretation that accounts for civil society's dependence on anti-black violence, a regime of violence that positions black people as internal enemies of civil society, end quote. They argue this violence, quote, cannot be analogized with the regimes of violence that disciplines the Marxist subaltern, the post-colonial subaltern, the colored but non-black Western immigrant, the non-black queer, or the non-black woman, end quote. According to Frank B. Wilderson, the scholar who coined the term as it functions most popularly today, Afropessimism theorizes blackness as a position of, using the language of scholar Saidiya Hartman, quote, accumulation and fungibility, end quote. That is a condition of or relation to ontological death, as opposed to a cultural identity or human subjectivity. Jared Sexton locates the foundational thread of Afropessimism in the, quote, motive force of a singular wish inherited in no small part from black women's traditions of analysis, interpretation, invention, and survival, end quote. As opposed to humanist anthropologists, historians, sociologists, and political scientists who engage the history of black subjectivity as one of entrenched political discrimination and social ostracization, Afropessimists across disciplines have argued that black people are constitutively excluded from the category of the self-possessing, rights-bearing human being of modernity. Wilderson writes that, quote, blacks do not function as political subjects. Instead, our flesh and energies are instrumentalized for post-colonial, immigrant, LGBT, and workers' agendas, end quote. God, that's fucking stupid. And Wikipedia says Frank B. Wilderson III, born 1956, is an American writer, dramatist, filmmaker, and critic. He is Chancellor Professor of African American Studies at the University of California, Irvine. He received his BA in Government and Philosophy from Dartmouth College, his Master of Fine Arts from Columbia University, and his PhD in Rhetoric and Film Studies from the University of California, Berkeley. Okay, back to the text. What they're saying is something like, you are quite right. Whatever you give us, it is not and will never be it, because it is not by progressive concessions that you can give us that what was excluded at the very moment of the constitution of the modern world and its economic foundations, namely our parentheses social and parentheses being. The social reality, the, quote, container, to continue with that metaphor, in which you now, quote, give us, end quote, these rights and other things, is based on the exclusion of our social being, on our ontological death. The ground on which you stand when you give us these rights is constituted by the exclusion of our being, or on our ontological death. The ground on which you stand when you give us these rights is constituted by the exclusion of our being. This is our truth, the truth to which we testify by, quote, never being satisfied, end quote. What is radical and radically interesting about this Afropessimism is precisely this move from, quote, we want to have more rights and more equality, end quote, to something like, quote, your white form of social being must disappear, end quote. As already Frantz Fanon put it, for the slave, the only cure, the only way to achieve freedom is, quote, the end of the human world, end quote, as it now exists. Again, this goes beyond psychology and beyond the question of good or bad, progressive or reactionary white people. And it is not about the need to blame the other to make the other responsible for our misery. In many less radical cases of contemporary struggles, we see how if a group manages to produce a guilt in the mainstream other, a dialectic emerges that is not really dialectical but more like a spiral heading toward implosion. In the context of a similar discussion, Slavoj Žižek points out the following: what the pseudo-radical liberal left is offering to the victims of racism and or sexism is the endless process of more and more concessions. Let's rewrite classic texts to make them acceptable to today's sensibilities. Let's purify our daily language. Let's destroy the monuments to all figures from the past who said or did something that is today considered problematic, etc. To this, the answer of the oppressed should be, quote, sorry, but that's not it. That's not it. You are bombarding us with such offers so that nothing could really change in the foundations of this social order, in which you retain your basic position of benevolent superiority, end quote. Afropessimism might do something like this, precisely, and cuts right into this spiral by naming the real stakes. Stop giving us rights, stop feeling guilty, making all these concessions, and disappear. That is to say, change radically as to what you are, what, quote, humans are. Because in this world, the very being of what is what is called, quote, human is based on the exclusion of blackness, on the exclusion of not what we are, but that we are. What may have begun as exclusion based on color became the color of exclusion as such, or a color based on exclusion of being. This is what, quote, blackness means. It's more than just a skin color and a ground for discrimination. It is the color of non-being. Crucial to this claim is the insistence on the distinction between the two levels, the level of, quote, structural suffering, ontological death, and the level of social oppression and discrimination. The first level does not necessarily directly translate into the second, and as Wilderson points out, following Fanon, it is not simply the amount of social discrimination that indicates what is being excluded. This is not, quote, oppression Olympics, end quote, competition between, say, blacks, women, Jews, proletarians, ... The argument that black is the color of non-being is based on a different ontological argument, which I think is of a profound interest for both philosophy and psychoanalysis, and it should be of interest to politics as well. Blackness in this sense has little to do with identity. It also has little to do with politics in the ordinary sense of the term. This is far from making Afropessimism apolitical. Rather, its core point is to insist on how genuinely emancipatory politics cannot shy away from a serious ontological debate, even when dealing with everyday injustices and inequalities. That's the end of the piece. Thanks for listening.